Hi, my name is Jesse at Trash Panda, and I've spent every single week over the past 4 years learning how discs are made. Are you seeing this? Are you seeing what I'm saying? And there's a topic which disc golf manufacturers typically don't like to talk about, including myself, but it's absolutely fascinating. And that topic is flashing. So we need to talk about what flashing is, what actually causes it, which might just be the most interesting part, and what disc golf manufacturers can do about it. Plus, there's something else we recently tried, but we'll get there. Okay, so full disclosure, I thought about doing like the simple version of the story and kind of just going through everything high level, but then I was like, no, we're deep diving. This one's for the nerds. But don't worry, I'm actually gonna go back to the beginning of my journey because when I first started in my garage, I had no idea what flashing or really even injection molding was. So let's start there with the question, what is flashing? At its most basic level, a mold is made up of multiple pieces. And basically, every place where those pieces meet is an opportunity for plastic to actually get outside of the mold. So, I've got the garage mold to demonstrate. If you didn't already know, I started making discs out of my garage where I would literally hang on a bar and inject into these tiny little molds. And this was the very first place I encountered flashing. So this was the garage mold. And basically, as you can see, this would be what was the top of the disc. This would be the bottom of the disc. So when plastic gets injected into a mold, it fills out entirely, but there's always gonna be this tiny little area between the two pieces of the mold where plastic can get in. So the literal first time I ever encountered flashing myself, I was actually hanging on the machine and pushing so hard that this aluminum plate just started to deflect. Gosh, I have almost blocked that out. It feels like forever ago. Anyway, the first thing I didn't realize when I first encountered it, I actually learned when we scaled in partnership with a local manufacturer. I've said it before on the channel, but basically the #1 rule in injection molding is that you should always inject from thick to thin, not thin to thick. What I learned with that manufacturer was that basically the second rule of injection molding is that flashing equals bad. Basically, I'd heard of flash through disc golf, but I didn't realize that flashing was something that every injection molded product has to deal with. In an injection machine, it is insane how much pressure there is to inject plastic in. I mean, I know I mentioned like in the garage I was pushing down really hard. That was nothing compared to an injection machine. So when you think about how much pressure is internal in the mold, it's honestly no wonder that flashing occurs. However, discs being injected from thin to thick, you need that extra pressure on the outside to move the plastic and fill out those outer walls, which means you're way more prone to flashing. Okay, we are definitely in the rabbit hole now. So at this point, flashing happens in all of injection molding, but it is even more common in disc golf discs. And if you don't believe me, that's totally fine. But Smarter Every Day and MVP just put out a video, actually 2 videos, which are both worth watching, that very much so validated me. TPU, which most premium plastics on the market are made out of, is a plastic that is so finicky and just really does not like to be thick. But as the wing of a disc gets wider, the plastic has to fill out a thicker spot. And in that video, you can see that MVP is not injecting from thin to thick with overmolded discs. Instead, they're injecting what they call the core, which is just thin to thin basically, and then they're injecting the rim, which is the exact same wall thickness all around. But as they talked about in the video, they still run into flashing issues. So if we're in the business of making 99% of things that are injection molded, like bottle caps or buckets, then flashing is not a good thing. But if we're in the business of making discs, then flashing basically is a necessary evil. As crazy as this sounds, that lesson right there basically took me 2 years to learn. And oh boy, do I wish I could go back to that dude in his garage and just say that one sentence, because it would have saved so much headache. But here we are, no big deal, and now we both know. Now it might seem like that's the answer to why flashing actually happens, but what absolutely blew my mind is another piece of the story that has to do with how injection molding machines are actually designed. So I'm in a different room in our warehouse because it's loud and manufacturing out there, but I'll show it on the screen right now. This is what an injection molding machine looks like. And basically there are two halves of the machine. There's the clamping unit and the injection unit. Honestly, if you want to just think about it as the left side of the machine and the right side of the machine, that's totally fine. Starting on the right side of the machine, basically all the injection unit does is deal with melting and injecting the plastic itself. And then as plastic flows through the machine, it moves over to the clamping unit. And the clamping unit, pretty much all it does is hold the mold closed. You can actually think about it with the garage mold. Basically, the clamping unit on the garage mold was this grade 8 bolt. It is crazy thinking about it now. Now, instead of a grade 8 bolt, we have 220 tons of pressure available to hold the mold closed, which is an insane amount of pressure. But this is where I think it gets absolutely fascinating. Injection molding machines are literally designed so that the clamping unit will fail first. What do I mean by that? If you have an injection unit that can send a ton of pressure into the mold, and the clamping unit will hold that closed, and this pressure is so much that it needs to go somewhere, it would be a very big problem if it went backwards. So if necessary, and literally by design, the clamping unit will actually microscopically open up so that pressure has somewhere to go other than backwards. Because if not, if there was too much internal pressure, I don't know what the scientific term is, but everything would go boom. So then when you combine all three reasons, the fact that discs are injected from thin to thick, the fact that TPU really does not like to be made into a thick part, and the fact that injection molding machines are designed with that failsafe, all of that basically becomes the reason that every single disc golf manufacturer has to deal with flashing. So we're almost at the point of talking about what manufacturers can do about this, but it's important to acknowledge two different types of flashing. So far, we've only been talking about what's called parting line flashing. And basically, that's where the two halves of the mold meet. But what if you have a 3-part mold? Because plastic shrinks when it cools, another thing I learned in the garage was that it is very, very, very hard to get a disc out of a 2-part mold. So a lot of molds are designed as 3 parts. On them, you have the same cavity or top of the disc, but then the other plate is split into 2 parts, called the core and the stripper plate. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, basically any place where molds meet is an opportunity for plastic to get through. So when you split this piece into 2 parts, you're basically adding another opportunity for flashing. Now it's kind of a double-edged sword, because when you do that, you're also adding another opportunity for air to escape, which is actually a good thing. So it's like both good and bad. Ultimately, flashing at the bottom of the rim is less common because when you think about plastic flowing into a mold, it's not pushing the 2 plates apart. Plastic is actually pushing the stripper plate and cavity together. So why do we see flashing at the bottom of the rim? I haven't included bad mold design, which is a part of any problem we could see, so I'm just gonna leave that out entirely. But really, the main reason for flashing at the bottom of the rim is gonna be wear and tear. Because when you think about it, that mold opens and closes like this, and those faces are ultimately rubbing up against each other tens, hundreds of thousands of times. There's also another thing that plays into this that's kind of unique in disc golf. And it's the idea of swapping inserts, like having the top of this mold and the bottom of this mold. I feel like people are probably most aware of that from like infinite discs, because most infinite discs are the top of one end of a mold with the bottom of another end of a mold. So like the top of a Destroyer and the bottom of a Shrike. Don't quote me on that one specifically, because I don't even know if that's a thing. But basically in disc golf, people will use the tops and bottoms or sides and cores of all kinds of different molds. The reason I bring that up is because it could be another reason for why flashing actually happens. Because if the top and bottom or side and core or any of these pieces that are being interchanged don't fit up absolutely perfectly, it could also lead to more flashing. So what can manufacturers do about this? Well, based on the fact that now there's videos out there from other manufacturers, not just us, I would say that any disc golf manufacturer should accept the necessary evil of parting line flashing, so flashing at the edge of the rim, and plan to flash the mold and thus trim the flashing. On our end, it's not the best solution, but we currently do that by hand with a razor blade. And when you do it on tens of thousands of discs, you'll just have to trust me, you get pretty good at it. How good, you ask? Well, when we were moving to the new warehouse, I found this box. And I had to ask the guys, what even is this box that's labeled perfection? Turns out, they had literally collected all of the flashing that they had trimmed in these perfect rings. I don't want to rip one because then the guys will get mad at me, but I'm telling you, you get really, really good. But the long-term better solution is to build an actual tool. And again, shout out to MVP here. I think a lot of people had seen videos previously from like Gateway doing it, but MVP showed the whole flashing tool, which to me is crazy. Like, I can't believe they didn't show the triple foil stamping machine, but they showed the flashing tool. But I'm grateful. So as a disc golf manufacturer with parting line flashing, I think the best thing to do is just to accept that it'll happen and build some kind of post-processing tool to trim it after the fact. By the way, if you've seen the MVP video, then you know not only did they accept the fact that flashing would occur, but they designed a channel to make sure that flashing occurred, and thus it was a consistent thing to trim, which again is absolutely brilliant. And I'm so grateful that they shared that. But what about flashing on the bottom of the rim? This is one that is tricky because technically the right way to do it is to have it at the very bottom. But as we all know, it rubs against your finger. So on the Proto Canyon, I actually wanted to try something different. And for this, I want to give the hat tip to Discraft because I saw it on some of their drivers. But I wanted to just try, instead of having it at the very bottom of the rim, offsetting it ever so slightly. What I didn't expect by doing that was the good and bad I talked about of it being at the bottom. So now it's offset and you don't notice it when you're throwing the disc, but it was much harder for us to build a process for making this disc without getting air trapped in that bottom bead because of the way we designed it. So on the next iteration, we're actually moving it down ever so slightly, but I'm still pretty happy with where it's at. And I think if we just tuck it into the corner of the bead, we should be fine. We'll watch this back in a couple months and we'll all see together. So I think in terms of the bottom of the rim flashing, the best solution is to just offset it. I don't know, time will tell. We are learning this one in real time. But I think that's the way to go. Because you could argue just build a two-piece mold, but man, is it hard to get the disc out unless you're overmolding it. But then on overmolding, you have two other areas where flashing could occur because of where the plastic is actually fusing to the other plastic. So I guess if I'm just trying to zoom out of this deep dive, the main thing I've learned, the moral of the story, is that flashing is much more common than I first thought it was. And honestly, as a disc golf manufacturer, it's just going to happen. What you choose to do with that after you make the disc is ultimately the most important part. I don't know if this was fascinating for you. In my opinion, it's so interesting and I hope you enjoyed. If anything, I would have loved to have this video 4 years ago, so that's why I'm making it today. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to support the channel and we'll see you next time. We're actually updating the design of the Proto Canyon with one more thing because the way we designed the mold, it became very hard to get a perfect trim on the flashing. And that's because of this little lip right here. This lip is so small that if you had this disc in your hands, you probably wouldn't even be able to see it. But because the parting line is right on the edge of that corner, it becomes almost impossible for us to get a perfect trim. So yeah, the importance of the design itself cannot be understated.